You're good?
I gotta love it, man. You know, gotta love screwing that stuff up. So we are finally live on YouTube. Yay.
Hey.
All right. Well, sorry about that, folks. I missed a setting on the connection from Restream to YouTube, so I had to get that sorted out. We're also up on Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, Rumble, and wherever else this goes. So, Steve, welcome back.
Hi.
And of course, the insanity in society continues. I think you would probably agree with that, right?
Oh, yeah. I'm on board.
Yeah. We didn't have a moment of sanity out there, did we?
No, we're just trying to unravel it.
Well, you know, one of these days. So by the way, just to repeat, this is season 15, episode 3 for May 18, 2023. And sorry for the delay and the screw up there. So we're going to, you know, we're just kind of restarting for the YouTube audience since I forgot one setting that throws it all off. And so anyway, today's topic is Napoleon and Champollion. And what did you find now?
Well, basically, let's go where we left off. I think we left off at the Council of Nicaea. And one of the things I've learned in trying to describe this type of stuff that we're talking about is that the more times you can take it from another era and show how similar things are happening, you sort of get like a cookie cutter pattern. And I think probably this is what was going on in the Enlightenment. This was what was going on in the Renaissance. And it's always the same reemergence of Platonism or Neoplatonism. And there's a pattern, but I thought we'd jump ahead to something that might be a little bit more familiar to people. And that would be the French conquest of Egypt and what they were really up to and why it's ended up being so detrimental to modern society. Okay.
So we're still seeing the ramifications of that.
Well, it's like every era, you've got somebody that finds a fraud, like the Corpus Hermeticum, or today, another one would be the Nag Hammadi scrolls. But all the way back, you'd find different things that were definitely proved a fraud. Another one's the letters of Pseudo Dionysius. And it takes a little bit of time for somebody to figure out how to get around the proof that they're a fraud. So they either find another discovery or manufacture something else or misinterpret something so that you have to start the cycle all over again. Scholars have to go in there and that, a lot of times what I'm finding is that the scholars that do the main research and find this stuff out never get reported. It's always the ones that fit the agenda.
Well, in my experience, just from the couple of books I have back there in my own field of research, it's usually the scholars who are behind the cover up. In fact, that's why I wrote my article 9 years ago that I released 9 years ago this week or last week, Spies in Academic Clothing, you know,
right.
Because they're always behind this crud.
Well, as I said before we went on, one of the things I was absolutely convinced of is that Isaac Newton was an Arian, which was the original Christian, the worst of Christian heretics. And I thought maybe I was a little bit unique in discovering that. And just last night, I plugged it into my browser and I found a paper from Johns Hopkins University saying most scholars believe Isaac Newton was an Arian. And the difference is that most of these people are for it. But they fully admit to it.
Well, and then, you know, if they know that little tidbit, then they should be able to unravel.
It's up to us to find the tidbits and then, you know, hook them together.
Yeah. But, you know, you would think that some academic someplace would then set about unraveling all of this stuff, but they never do. And my own belief is that tenured professors are on the take. you
Yeah.
know.
Oh, and
There,
that's a good, I mean, that's a good topic, I think, probably all in itself is, how many kids went to school and learned that Columbus thought the earth was flat and that if he traveled off the edge, he'd fall off and be eaten by monsters. And
right.
how many people thought that Galileo was arrested and for saying that the earth was saying that the sun wasn't in the center of the solar system and the earth was. And you look back at that point in time, yeah, there was a discussion about it, but a lot of people believe that. It wasn't Galileo that first believed it. It was, and that whole discussion, the papers exist. People have found what the real trial was about, and it wasn't about that. And
Well,
you can pick things through history and show that.
right. Well, it's like if you go into book 12 of the Florentine Codex called The Conquest, most people believe that Columbus showed up on the or Cortez showed up on the coast of Mexico and just immediately went in and started mass murdering people. Well, and then you start doing research, and it was the Aztecs who were the mass murderers. And so many of the surrounding tribes, the Aztecs are also known as the Mexica, from where we get Mexico from. And so many of the surrounding tribes were fed up that when Cortez arrived, they joined him and they said, yeah, we're sick of the Mexicans. We'll help you overthrow them.
And a similar thing happened in the foundation of Israel, in that they set up the whole, and this is books from University of Wisconsin, they set up the whole myth of Masada the same way, that all these people were, murdered or killed or something like that. And what was on Masada was just terrorist groups, and the Romans were just trying to protect the Jews from the terrorists. It's a continuous string of misinterpreted facts and propaganda that's, it's obviously has a design.
Well, sure, and it's like going back, 400 years into the 430 years plus into the Salem witch trials, and you've read my paper on that. And all of that is propaganda as well. And it's all intentionally spun to make the Christians appear as a bunch of superstitious nitwits when they were far more educated and intelligent than most people with a doctor's degree today.
Right.
Most people would hardly be able to understand the average person's writings from 1693.
One of the things, and try to move it into our topic a little bit, is that getting back to Isaac Newton, it's very clear to me that Isaac Newton had a two-pronged plan. One was to put alchemistry as the basis for modern science, which I would say is what you're seeing today in artificial intelligence, this idea that you can have one theory or one formula or something that will explain everything at the expense of, literally at the expense of reason. You see that in quantum theory and things. But the other thing is, the other prong was to basically invalidate the Trinitarian formula in the Bible, which he wrote a big paper on that. And one of the things that happened is he was celebrated for writing a theory of light, which both Goethe and a guy named Thomas Young later contested. And it was really Thomas Young that cleaned up his theory and made it scientific. And it was also Thomas Young who complained against Champollion about the Egyptian hieroglyphs. So there's like a thread that goes through all this stuff. The same guy that basically said Isaac Newton was mistaken in his theory of light is the same one that argued against the discoverer of supposedly translating the Rosetta Stone. Those all things should be clues that something's wrong,
Cacique says, well, the Spanish ramsacked, I think he means ransacked, the Incas for sure. Hit the like folks. I guess he means hit the like for the show. Certainly the Spanish Christians did shut down a lot of major human sacrifice centers and whatnot, but that's for another show. So right now we're gonna do the deep dive into Napoleon, etc. So let's go on with that.
Okay, so the story for me started when I was researching the Dead Sea Scrolls and found out there was always a French connection to everything. Every time you looked behind the scenes in one of these episodes, there were French scholars or French interpreters or French explorers and stuff. And I became convinced there obviously was some sort of French, what would you call it? A plan, a plot of some sort, a predisposition to see things a certain way. One of the earliest advocates of modernism was Rousseau. And most of this starts with, he wrote a thing called Emile on education. And within that writing was a text called the Creed of the Savoyard Priest. And what he was doing is he was advocating that religion, especially Catholicism, should, rather than face all the different criticisms and things like that, it should be just a religion of actions and motions that you didn't really necessarily believe in. So what happened is it set the stage for the French, because the French took this more serious than anything, to turn Catholicism in sort of a religion of just ambiance, which meant you could now take things like neo-Platonism and make the theology neo-Platonic, while at all the time on the outward side look like you're actually being an Orthodox Catholic. So what happened is you end up with this kind of different motive for religion that really think it's sort of salvation by an odd thing, that you view salvation as sort of an allegiance to something rather than a belief in something. Okay. I want to quote, and I'm going to apologize to everybody a little bit, because last week I had these things printed out that I could drop on screen. So I may not look at the lens here all the time. I'm going to drop another screen here and read some things. And hopefully as we go on, I can bring up pictures and things like that. So anyhow, Napoleon's got he's actually Italian, but he has this goal of creating an empire. One of the I'm going to read a quote from Napoleon early on. As Napoleon later put it when describing his feelings at this time, this is from a book called Napoleon in Egypt. I saw the way to achieve all my dreams. I would found a religion. I saw myself marching on the way to Asia, mounted on an elephant, a turban on my head, and in my hand a new Quran that I would have composed to suit my needs. In my enterprises, I would have combined the experiences of the two worlds, exploiting the realm of all history for my own profit. And this is another quote that from a letter he wrote back to the French and the Egyptians. People of Egypt, you will have been told that I come as an enemy of Islam. This is a lie. I have come to restore your rights and punish those who oppress you. I worship God more than your oppressors. I respect Muhammad, his prophet, and the Holy Quran. The French are also true Muslims. The proof of this can be seen in the fact that they have marched against Rome and destroyed the throne of the Pope, who constantly incited the Christians to make war on all Muslims. So you see, Napoleon mounts about 33,000 troops. At that time, you have the Ottoman Empire, but the Egypt was it had sand had covered up a lot of the monuments. Nobody knew really what was down there. Napoleon kind of tries to do an end around attack on Egypt, and he actually lands far away from the cities he tends and conquer, and makes his troops without hardly any provisions at all engage in conquesting Egypt. So he marches through all these different things. Ultimately, he loses about a third of all his soldiers and people. But among this group is all the best scientists, everybody he could amass in the French Republic or Empire at the time. They're going to rediscover something. They're going to make this idea of kind of advancing the cause of France as the true salvation of knowledge and intelligence and all that kind of stuff. So he's marching towards Alexandria and things like that. And all along he's finding, they're gradually finding monuments, and these scientists are digging them up. And I would say one of the main goals, and I'm not trying to, I don't consider myself a major historian of all this stuff, but I'm interested in the scientific and religious aspect of this. So what he's trying to do, and this is still with us to this day, is he's trying to basically show that Greek philosophy is founded on a basis of Egyptian mythology. So they're doing everything they can to find connections, supposed connections between all these ancient Egyptian gods, which they're trying to replace with all the Judeo-Christian ones. And their main way of doing this, his major cause to begin with, is to use all his sciences and amass these scientists to prove that the calendar is wrong. And what he wants to prove is that none of the Jewish calendars hold up. And by doing that, he wants to link all these different writings. He at the time that people would have considered the Bible as the most reliable because it was all written down. He wanted to switch that into the idea that these monuments and stones actually were more reliable history. Okay. So I'm going to switch screens here a little bit, and hopefully I can bring this up to make this work.
All right.
So his main thing is the.
Do you want to put it on screen, or?
I will. I'm going to find it here. So just bear with me. So what he does, one of the monuments he finds is, okay, this should work. Now I'm going to go back here and hopefully this will bring it up. You see that?
Yep.
Okay, so that's what's called the Dendera zodiac.
Yep. We've shown that on the show before.
Okay, so the Dendera zodiac, everybody thinks that the Rosetta Stone was the most important artifact that was taken out of Egypt. What happened is part of Napoleon's scheme was to outwit the British, and the British wouldn't have it, so they came and basically, once Napoleon had failed, they took everything over. The British ended up with a Rosetta Stone, which they kind of conveyed as being the most important artifact. In fact, as far as Napoleon was concerned, this was the most important artifact. And what he believed was that this was a star chart that went back 1,500, 2,000, maybe even 6,000 years before Christ. And he believed he had ways of deciphering this thing. He saw all these images within the circle as being constellations in the sky. So I don't know if my pointer shows up here, but the square point here in the middle, the whole thing was too heavy for them to move back to Paris. So they basically chopped the square section out and left this woman, which is kind of the legend. So when you get into Egyptian hieroglyphs, one of the things you'll see is that when they want to show the heavens, it's usually often a naked woman arched over the ground, balancing on her toes and her fingertips. So I believe what this indicates is that she's representing the heavens, and probably indicating that the star chart is what you would see if you would look up in the sky. Okay. The thing to look at here is, so when Champollion goes, he's in France. He doesn't even go to Egypt until nearly the end of his life. He's on board with this being a proof initially of an ancient foundation of the Egyptian people. But all he can go by is this woman on the right and the string of hieroglyphs on either side of her, and as an artist rendition. Okay, so what's important of this, if you can look down to her toes on what's our left, there's a hieroglyph way down in the corner here. Okay.
Yep.
Hieroglyph is becomes immensely important later on. So what happens is Champollion, he's one that finds himself on the wrong side of who's ever in charge. Who's ever in charge of France goes back and forth quite a bit at that time. And Champollion is constantly getting into trouble over what he's doing and why he's doing it. And he has a brother that, and usually in the thing, one's the Champollion, the older, and one's the younger. Champollion, the one we talk about, is younger, but it's the older one that's supporting this, the younger, because he's pretty much on the dole. He doesn't like working. He doesn't like teaching. He gets in trouble with everybody, the government, everything. So he's working on this with Thomas Young that we were just talking about. Champollion has taken courses in understanding Egyptian things and Coptic and hieroglyphs and things like that. But he's kind of misrepresenting the whole thing. His major teacher, I think his name was Desassi, starts warning Thomas Young that Champollion, all he knows is how to steal people's ideas and take credit for them himself. So what happens is they made up this kind of an escapade in that Champollion gets in trouble with the people he's supposed to be working for. And they sentence him back to his original city of Figeac in France, which is far removed from everything. What happens is that before Champollion is interested in all this, his dad runs a bookstore. And that becomes his vocation because he basically is sequestered in his own city. He can't leave it. And he becomes a school teacher. While he's a school teacher, as kind of a retaliation because he can't communicate, and he's got this reputation that he steals other people's ideas, he writes a letter. And it's a famous letter called the Letter to Dacier. And in that letter, and I'm looking for it here because I got a picture of it. The Letter to Dacier basically has a formula for how you translate hieroglyphs that he's not totally owning up to. He's got let's see here. You still see this?
Yep.
This is his book. It becomes a book eventually, but it's his letter to Dacier and how do you take Egyptian hieroglyphs and decipher them. So you got to remember, most people at this time still were convinced that Thomas Young had an adequate enough translation of it. But he had this idea of taking this even farther. So all this has to do with the Rosetta Stone, which is in England, and it's not in France. So Young has access to it, and Champollion doesn't. So it's a very high-priced thing to can we get copies of it to translate and all that other stuff. And in this letter, you can see there's a lot of talk, but eventually he's telling this formula for translating hieroglyphs, but he's leaving major parts out of it. And this is all whatever. So let me see if I can find a picture of his hieroglyphics. So here's towards the end of the letter. He's got a formula for translating this, but he's not really telling anybody how he does it. Everybody's convinced that he now understands how to do it, but he's keeping the thing secret and how he gets around to it. So what you got to understand now, he's been silenced from the academia, from the scientific community, and he's basically teaching school children. What the thing at that time that's really popular in all of education is this book here. Let's see if I can get this working. It's called Les Begueras de Seigneur. And basically it's a kid's book from the 1600s. And it's basically all kids kind of things, plays and things, all that kind of stuff. Stuff a teacher would use to teach how to spell and how to do, to make it fun. In the middle of this book, though, is these pages. Here's one set of pages, and here's another set of pages. And if you look at the top, especially on here, you have de rebus. And what it is the rebus principle. Okay. So here's examples of the rebus principle. So down here, you have a musical phrase where la, mi, fa, re, so, and what you do is you take those together and you use them to spell things. So if you can think of, you drive down the road and you see a bumper sticker with a picture of an eye, and you see a picture of a heart for love, and you have a picture of just the letter U, most people would recognize that I love you right off the bat. What Champollion has discovered here, and they don't, nowhere is this admitted to, because they want to make Champollion this big intelligent person, is that he's taking this whole rebus principle from this French book that they're using to teach school kids. And what he's doing is he's applying it to hieroglyphics. So what the rebus principle does is they're taking letters from these pictures and these hieroglyphs and using them to spell names. So what he discovers, going back to the Rosetta Stone, is that there's certain words that we would think of words today that are just hieroglyphs, but they're drawing circles around them, which is called a cartouche. The cartouche is just French for a cartridge, as in a gun. And so what they're seeing these cartouches as packaging these things, Champollion realizes that he can spell words by just using the first letters in these pictures. And so all of a sudden he gets the names Cleopatra, and later he gets Ramses and all this other kind of stuff. But he doesn't tell anybody. Even to this day, there's people that will deny that Champollion was using the rebus principle to discover anything. So he's basically...
So Cleopatra, etc., wasn't really Cleopatra.
Well, she's Cleopatra, but he's using kind of an odd sort of way of getting at that. And for the most part, it's correct. But there's tons and tons of hieroglyphs there. The main thing, if you take a modern course in hieroglyphs, you find out that most hieroglyphs don't really have much to do with mythology. They're very hard to translate. Most of them have very little to do with mythology. Most of them have to do with scribes and people just keeping track of things. Egypt at that time was in a kind of a miraculous position in that the Nile flowed south, or the Nile flowed from south to north, but the winds prevailed going the other direction. So they could basically take boats from one end to the other and either flow with the stream or flow with the wind. The Nile was very prosperous. So Egypt at the time basically was the breadbasket of the world because they had a transportation system and they had a way of growing all these things. So the main reason Egyptian scribes would have needed to use these hieroglyphs is basically for accounting. But you ended up with this kind of weird dichotomy, is that we had talked in the past about Kircher, Athanasius Kircher. Most of these people were still on one hand trying to refute Kircher as being a crank and a quack, even though he had sent emissaries all over the world trying to find this stuff out. I'm going to kill this again here and come back. Even though I can show that he's still copying Kircher. What he's discovered here is not all that remarkable. And we can show that again. So I'm going to go back here for a second to the other screen. You're going to lose me for a second here.
All right.
It switched my screens back for me. So I want to go back to the Dendera zodiac again.
You want to share the screen again?
Yep. I want to get it on screen here first, and then we'll
Sure.
share it. So here's the Dendera zodiac again.
All right.
The thing that actually cracked the code for Champollion had nothing to do with anything we've seen up to this date, except for the rebus principle. And the reason is down at the bottom of here, this hieroglyph, this cartouche actually is the Greek word artifact, or autocrat, I should say. And Champollion did that, and he said any star chart made in that period would not have a Greek word in it. And that's really what got Champollion famous, is that, but he didn't want to tell anybody where he had gotten it from. And it was this cartouche that was on this, what was left back in Egypt because it was too heavy to transport to Paris. So eventually, by the end of his life, Champollion, the Catholic Church wanted to make him a cardinal for a period, and Champollion declined it because finding that out to him proved that the calendar, later on, there's a French woman who proves that this calendar dates back to about 60 BC. But they accredited Champollion with actually rescuing Christianity by proving that the calendar was more or less correct. The problem is towards the end of his life, Champollion, and you can find pictures of him. I'll show it, and maybe I can show him later rather than lose this picture. So Champollion kind of adopts Islam. Most of the pictures that you see him from this period, he's dressed as a Muslim. He goes, and of course, one of the first things he wants to see is what's left of the zodiac of Dendera. And he goes there. This piece is still there. And he goes and looks at that hieroglyph, and it's blank. There never was anything there. So the problem is, what artist fabricated a cartouche to contain a Greek word? In order to do it, he would have had to have been able to read Egyptian hieroglyphs.
And you're saying just that one down there on the bottom left.
Yeah. There's a very good book called the Zodiac of Paris. And let me see if I got the names of the people. Look it up. It's Jaffowitz, I think her name is, and there are two scholars that looked this up. And so it basically shows that there's a major fraud going on here. That Champollion's clearly taking credit for being able to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs, but how does he end up getting duped by a hieroglyph that was already there and fabricated by somebody else? That was before he was even involved in trying to translate these things.
And he based a significant amount of his translation on that one cartouche, right?
Being able that gave him, along with the rebus principle, that gave him his formula and validated his formula for translating hieroglyphs. But you'll look a long ways, except for those books, and these are reputable scholars that wrote this book. That cartouche is not there on the original and never was there on the original. So the question,
so do we have a photograph of the original?
There is one in the book. I don't know if I have it on here or not. There is in the book. But you can see these are all pictures that this is actually one of the pictures that they originally sent back to Paris that he was working off of. It's a major, it leads you to believe that there's another agenda, is what I'm trying to say. That the whole idea of what he was up to is not exactly right. So anyhow, is there any questions? Does this make sense or not so far? Any questions on all this?
Nope, not yet.
Okay, so I sent you a picture.
Somebody asked if he was if Champollion was the Bill Gates of his time.
Yeah, I'd have to think about that.
Ripping other people's stuff off, right?
Yeah, that I would say, yeah, he was.
Yeah,
in that sense, yeah.
And then somebody else said,
people from that era, his own professors were accusing him of that.
Yeah. somebody else said the OG Hooked on Phonics.
Yeah.
And a couple of people said great series so far.
So I mean, there's other stuff here. There's let me see if I can find them here. Let me go back. This is something from that period that was very popular. Here we go. This was very popular in that period. It was called, here's the title page, is the Hieroglyphic Bible.
You want to, there you go. All right.
This is the Hieroglyphic Bible. This, and you can look at the date. This is all from that same period. This is in English, but it was very popular that it was a teaching technique in the early 1800s that was in vogue all around the world. So you go back in here, and here's an example of the beginning of Genesis and things. In the beginning was, and then they show you a picture, the, heavens and the, all that kind of stuff. It was a way of teaching, but it exactly fit what Champollion was up to in deciphering hieroglyphs. This was the principle that he was using, and for some reason, nobody caught him at it.
Well, if you're going to make a story up, you might as well use a 5-year-old's book, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it would be like, using Dr. Seuss to translate the Egyptian hieroglyphs today.
All right. Here's probably one of the most famous. You can look at this. This is Wallace Budge, and he's one of the most famous Egyptologists in the world. He specifically says, it will probably be admitted by all that the compiler of any Egyptian hieroglyph dictionaries should know at firsthand every collection of Egyptian monuments and papyri in the world, that he would have visited every great museum on the continent in Egypt, England, and America, and copied or collated and printed editions, every hieroglyph, hieratic, and demotic text of importance. They should know well the histories of written by classic writers and the works of Arab geographers, Coptic dialects. And he goes on and he's saying, it would take a lifetime to come to the conclusions that Champollion's coming to, and here he's just doing it by copying off of, kids' books. Okay. So what was he really up to? Let's see if I can find this. Do you have the one that I just sent you?
The file?
Yeah, the one that I said I just got done translating out of French.
Yeah, somewhere here, except now I have my screen on full screen.
I'm having trouble finding it here.
Because you've got it shared. I can't. There you go. Now okay. I can pull it up. Let's see here. Where did it go?
Otherwise, I can maybe look for mine too.
Here, I've got it. All right. Let me do a share.
Yeah. And understand, Champollion, he wrote other books, but he really didn't. He really didn't write any books about what we think. It was just a letter that he had written, the dossier. Now, if you scroll down here, this took me weeks to translate out of the French, because to my knowledge, it's only a French edition. They have other editions, but the problem I'm finding in all this is that in order to figure out the bottom line of all this, you'd actually have to you have to know French, you'd have to know Greek, you'd have to know Latin, and you have to be able to not just to know it, you have to translate academic texts, which you actually can do fairly easily, and if you know at least a little bit to know when it's headed south to translate. So scroll down and you can see what Champollion was really up to here.
Okay, how far?
You'll see pictures.
All right.
There you go. And what the majority of references in this book are to the god Thoth. And if you keep going, you'll find more and more and more and more and more. These are all different versions of the Egyptian god Thoth. And if you read the text is all trying to prove that Thoth is the same guy as the Greek god Hermes. And if you remember, going back to Ammonius Saccas, that's the exact same thing the Arians were trying to prove.
So his real agenda is tying Hermes to Thoth
which I think was partially
to try to take the proven false Hermeticism back millennia to try to resubstantiate it, essentially.
Okay, so now you have to go back to Napoleon again. So give me the screen back. You can, I think I've showed my point on this, is that this is all translated out of the French. Now you have to go back to Napoleon. What was Napoleon's real agenda? So now I'm going to go back here, and there's a book published by University of Delaware Press called Napoleon's Sorcerers, the Suffesians. So all these different people that Napoleon has hired as academics, I'm going to give it back here. This is a page from the book. I don't know if you can see it.
Yep.
But there's major things in here. You can kind of see where I've underlined them. You can look at this. All this stuff is these Suffesians were really all Hermeticists, all trying to prove that Thoth and Hermes were the real foundation of authentic religion. And you can see if you just glance through here.
Yep.
See words like the Corpus Hermeticum.
Thoth, Hermes. Yep.
Yeah, well,
Hermes Trismegistus.
Yeah. Down where my pointer is, Ammonius Marcellinus, a friend of the apostate Emperor Julian. You see where it's all connecting together?
Yep.
So what's
so this is all because of what Champollion had done.
He's a crucial link because he's got to link all this text somehow. You know, remember how we talked about namely Iamblichus, and all the names are showing up here. Plato, Pythagoras. So what I'm trying to show you here is not only the links, but the fact that what I've been telling you for the last 2 weeks is it's really accepted scholarly stuff, but it's all hidden from us.
Right. And it's all a fraud based on
it's all a fraud
based on a children's book.
Right. And so what's happening here, and we all blame the Freemasons.
Right.
But what's really going on here, the Freemasons, if you do a bunch of research on it, you'll find that in the Church of England, they always make a joke out of Cromwell in that they canonized him. And in the Church of England, if you become a cardinal or something, they call it a canonization. What they did with him is they literally canonized him.
Oh, they put him in a cannon and they
chopped his head off and put it in a cannon and shot it off over the Thames.
Right. Yeah. So he was canonized.
All right. So right. So the thing is, what people miss is that for 10 years, England had a republic. And that's kind of where our republic got born, is in the failure of that republic. But what Cromwell had set up, because this was getting dangerous, obviously he lost his life due to it, is he set up a secret society where you could talk about these things. And that's really the birth of the Freemasons. It's not really that ancient.
So the Freemasons really stems from this that we're showing right here. And then when was Champollion working on the
early 1800s?
Early 1800s. All right. So don't they claim that that the that the Masons came from like 1776 or something like that?
Well, actually, if you're into Masonry, they'll say it goes back to the Old Testament, that they literally were architects and masons that go back to 400 or 500 BC.
Well, sure, I know that, but the modern version is like the 1700s, isn't it?
Yeah, but where did that? I mean, that would be from Cromwell's time. But the question is, where did they get all this other stuff? Okay, so here's the solution: is that the solution was that Napoleon's Suffesians infiltrated the Freemasons. And because they had this connective tissue between all the different governments of the world underneath, they became like the internet for this philosophy, all these discoveries.
So Orfeo in the chat says Cromwell as as origin of Freemasonry very bold. Unfortunately, that means much regarding the very origins of Calvinism, which you and I have covered extensively.
Yeah, and that,
as well.
if you look, I'll send you some stuff. We can cover that another time. A lot of that stuff, if you look at Calvinism, I'm convinced it has its birth in the Cathars, and that's becoming admitted to too.
Well, and the Calvinists were Gnostics, which we exposed a year or two ago on the show.
All right, go ahead and talk. I'm going to share another screen here.
All right, well, here, let's hit this real quick, and then you go back. But so the Calvinists, they were Gnostics, and they were heretics, and then because they were Gnostics, right at the same time, the printing press is being invented, and they're throwing themselves on the fires, and they're the first, essentially, to use the printing press as propaganda against the Catholic Church, to make the Catholic Church look like they massacred hundreds of thousands of Calvinists. Right.
Well, not only that, they changed the Lord's Prayer and all that kind of stuff.
And everybody regurgitates this hyperbole as though it's fact, hundreds of years later, that the Catholic Church did all this stuff, and the Spanish Inquisition did all this stuff, and never mind that you can go in and read the vast majority of the Inquisition court cases today, and the Inquisition,
all the documents exist.
Right. Yeah, and for many people don't know that the Inquisitions were courts. It'd be like going to your local county or state or federal court, and you have a case, and you're bringing charges against somebody who committed rape, murder, pedophilia, fraud, etc.
If you read these cases, they actually sound a lot like what's going on today. And they were convinced these people were possessed, and they were actually, most of them, they were just trying to help these people.
Right. Well, my favorite was, I got into it with these guys last year, and they brought up the Goa, India Inquisition. So I did some research on it. And in 252 or 256 years, something like that, there was 52 or 56 people sentenced to death. So it was like a quarter of a person every 4 years or something like that.
Well, not only that, you got to understand that society they didn't really have a penal system.
Right. But these
sort of like arresting John Dillinger or something for tax fraud.
Right. But these people, these modern liberal professors make it out like the church just went out mass murdering people, just like, earlier this guy in the chat said, oh, well, when the Spanish arrived to the Americas, they mass murdered the Incas or whatever. There's actually no evidence of that. And in fact, if you go back from when Columbus discovered the Americas, as soon as he returned, they declared that all of the natives were free. And then that was updated in 1503 by a decree from Queen Isabella of Spain, who said that all non-cannibals were free.
Right.
So,
but the thing is, here, I want to bring up this other piece of paper because I just found this last night. I told you about it, and I'll just look at the first page.
All right,
because it's relevant to it. That's why I had it here. Is you just read the first paragraph. John Milton's Paradise Lost was based on the secret gospel of St. John, which again goes back to the secret Cathar Arian text. So this is a paper published by Johns Hopkins University. Heretics, both John Milton and Isaac Newton, were, as most scholars now agree, Arians. There it is.
Yeah, you don't even have to read down the page. First,
that's all you need to read. And they go into what we've been talking about, the Trinity, and they denied the Trinity. And they go into how Newton got the Trinity, taken out of the Bible. And it's not like I'm inventing any of this. It's just,
Wow. And so then you go to, what's his name that we did the show on a couple years ago? Tischendorf.
This will lead into that. I'd like to make that another episode, though.
Oh, did I just give it away? All right.
No, that's a teaser. You can connect all the dots, and it's not really. I mean, it's
but wait a second. Wait a second. I still have to digest this part about the 5-6-year-old coloring book.
Okay. Go ahead.
But that's pretty funny stuff. And
yeah, it's hilarious.
Oh yeah, somebody Boru, hey Boru, I haven't seen you in the chat for a long time. He says cliffhanger.
I mean, what can you do but laugh at this stuff? It's so silly.
Well, and it's like, I constantly say that I've never liked fiction much, because you can't make this kind of stuff up. Like the intelligence community and the occults slapstick is ridiculous. It's
let's put a little teaser out for Tischendorf. What does he do? He's trying to validate an Arian Bible. That's what he's doing.
That took out the Trinity. So all of these guys, Ray, if you're listening, we did the show on the Trinity for Ray like a year and a half ago, and he didn't get any of it. Yeah. But so this is where this anti-Trinitarian stuff comes from, is the Arians. Wait, Iran? No, that's too.
Well, Arian and Iran, actually, that's the same.
Yeah,
yeah.
That I was giving it away without giving it away.
Right. But I mean, you can keep going. I mean, this story gets very, very thick. This is a highlight story of what's going on. If you dig into it, you'll find out there's no bottom to how far they were deceiving people.
So are you going to write this as a comedy book?
Well, I mean, all right, that's interesting, because how does Napoleon get this stuff passed? He becomes emperor, and they have no TVs and stuff like that. Right. And so what he does is they've got this theater district in Paris, and it becomes up to them to promote all this stuff. And there literally is a law that you can't speak against it. So what do the theater people do?
They turn it into comedy.
Well, think about it. They want to still promote that they're being screwed over by Napoleon. What do? They start having plays that you can't talk.
So then you have the pantomime.
You have where the mimes come from. They're traditionalists that don't want it, but they can't say anything, so they have to do it all in mime.
Oh, that's funny. So Daniel says the Gnostic heresy is literally the original sin that created the fall from paradise. Well, yeah, I think so.
I would, yeah, exactly. I mean, that's
the neo-Platonism and everything that we've taken years to unpack here.
Yeah. Well, and even farther, I would say, look at the Genesis. There's a teaching method derived from Aristotle, but kind of documented by Porphyry, and you can look this up anywhere. It's called the Tree of Porphyry. Yeah, but you can map that directly onto the stages of the creation. So basically, what Genesis is, and it's making distinctions. It's how's your mind work, and what's the last thing? Everything is yours, but don't try to know the mind of God.
So, and then Gorillas says satire, which the satyr was a symbol of the goat god, Satan.
Right. Exactly right. Right. And like I said, that, I'm digging out of my research. I'm just digging out a few little tidbits here, but this goes as deep as you want. You could do decades on this stuff. It's that crazy.
So, I've mentioned to you this gun colloquialisms book I've been working on, and, it's just, there's so much slapstick in firearm stuff. The British had it's like going back to canonizing Crowley. The British had a hilarious slapstick view of firearms, and it's enshrined throughout the English language. It'd be funny to go through the French and the Serbo-Croatian and the Russian and whatnot and find out how much of this stuff goes through there. But, it's almost like the same level of slapstick, where they're Thank you, Derek. Where they're taking all of this stuff and turning it into jokes, but the regular population doesn't get it. Derek in Canada says, can Steve explain Revelation as it relates to John? Well, Revelation was written by John, but do you want to tackle that?
I mean, there's a lot of argument as what that would be. Probably the most conventional is it's an early form of, what would you say, science fiction in a way, but not fiction. It's using there's different versions. Let me explain different versions. The one version is that there was a writing technique that they couldn't say things straight out in public as to what was what. So they would use all this fantastic imagery to display stuff. Oddly enough, the other side of this is kind of interesting too. And again, it goes back to Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton's probably, there's people all over the Baptist networks and things like that, that kind of network, where they talk about how the book of Daniel and the book of Revelations are connected together as prophecy of how these nations were going to, the two-headed people, and that they were kind of imagery that to display what was really going on historically. And there's an element of truth that, but the book that Isaac Newton probably sold the most of at the time was his book on Daniel and Revelations. And most people actually to this day, especially from that persuasion, copy it straight out of Isaac Newton. But I would say most of it is kind of I don't want to say it's science fiction because they wouldn't have believed it was fiction, but it was the idea of using fantastic imagery to convey kind of the awesomeness of God and how the earth will eventually have a fulfillment of and the return of Christ and would fix all this stuff. And so they used fantastic imagery to do that. And I'm not saying that the imagery is correct or not correct. It's just that's how they described it.
Was John using it to get across the concept of logos fiction, or the story of Revelation?
You could do a whole episode on just John, because John is written around 100 to 110 AD, which was 30, 40 years or so after the other gospels were written. And parts of it have been eliminated that we know. So the prelude, there's a prelude to the prelude. Most people consider the prelude in the beginning was the word. There's another prelude that's been documented that was before that. And it specifically says he's going against Gnosticism, particularly Simon the magician. And so there's a question whether John himself wrote this. Nobody reputable that I know believes that John didn't have something to do with it. The more likely case, I believe, is that, and this goes back to Purim and all this stuff, I believe what was big at that time was plays, Greek plays. So you had the play of Purim going on in one behalf, and then you had the story of Christ as a play. So there's many scholars that show the original book of John survived as a play that got performed once a year during Holy Week. And eventually the playwright was probably Papias, who he actually leaves his signature on the end of John, swearing that these things are all true and have been approved by John. And he tried to write all this down, but he couldn't get it all written in one thing because there's too many stories to tell. So I believe probably, and this is probably a bit of stretch for some people maybe, but that what we're talking about, 1 John, I believe was probably the original prelude to the book of John. And it's filled with a simplistic, but a very sophisticated and simplistic all at the same time of how you were supposed to understand John. And you were supposed to read that before you read John, so you would know it was coming. And if you take 1 John out, it doesn't make any sense.
Because you have to understand that he's talking about logos or reason
and the Trinity, and that Christ is the Logos. And so once you take
logos incarnate.
Right. And so now you take that out, Logos becomes now only has one reference in the Bible, and it becomes up for grabs.
And it gets watered down into the word, so people don't even grasp that it's really discussing logic, reason, reality, truth, etc.
I would go even farther than that, because around the end of the Middle Ages, they started, because of, and you can, one of my books on it's very, very controversial, but you had these plays going on all the time. And one of the things that led to World War II was the belief that Judaism was mocking Christianity in their Good Friday plays. So around the end of the Middle Ages, they would do John, and it was very popular to have the play is still done on Good Friday in most liturgical churches. A lot of churches do the play as it is in John. And I think that is authentic. The thing is, what people miss about, I would say, the whole thing is that one play was basically taking the side of the Bacchae, that emotions reigned supreme, and the taking of drugs or wine or something like that, because that's the dispute in Euripides' play, the Bacchae. Christianity would have taken the other side of it.
Right.
And we've talked about that in the influence of drugs on early Christianity.
Right. And that goes back to my early books and my 2008 book, The Holy Mushroom.
Right.
But I think in hindsight, because Allegro didn't grasp logos, he fell prey to the CIA's promotion of the fake Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right. The thing that I think is the key point here that we've talked about once before is that when Christ is on the cross, the soldier comes up and he wants to give him let's just call it a substance. Okay. And usually they talk about as the vinegar and the gall or something like that. But if you look, especially in Revelations, they refer to it specifically as absinthe, which under the right circumstances, a hallucinogen. Christ refuses it. That becomes a mystery cult eventually in the Roman soldiers around the year 100 AD or so, where they have these dens and they're doing all these. I forget the name of it.
What was the name of that cult? They had the underground. The
cult of the bull.
Correct. Mithra. You're right. And so Carl Ruck, who is my very first interview that I've since exposed as a big fraud, he was the one behind promoting a lot of that hyperbole.
That they were pushing that Christianity was really the cult of Mithra, but if you actually look,
it's actually the other way around.
It's the other way around. Yeah.
Right. Well, and of course, Professor Rock and his guys are going to spin and invert everything as they have always done. So let's see.
The people who like to invert stories and don't admit to.
And E. Daniel Ritter says there were always elders from Mount Athos that were teaching that, that the severity of the Gnostic heresy. And then,
getting back to Tischendorf as a teaser too, is that you had Orthodox priests coming down from Moscow who had already claimed that Tischendorf's text was heresy.
Right.
There's a lot of intrigue going behind that too.
And Orpheus says, I think it's a profound study in cycles, history, and linear fulfillment. Obviously, it's overwhelmingly zodiacal. I would argue that the Magian tradition was originally quite valid. And I replied to that. I said, I think the astrotheology aspect was put forward by Satanists like Blavatsky, etc. Probably.
And we've been talking about Athanasius Kircher, where Blavatsky and Crowley got that is straight out of Athanasius Kircher's writings from the 1600s.
Right. So they're fudging that. And of course, I bought into that crap with my first book, Astrotheology and Shamanism. Right.
Right.
So, that whole thing, and you and I have gone deep into Blavatsky and the Cambridge group and all of that,
That needs to be probably gone into it too, because I think they're connected to the Tischendorf and the King James Bible, revised Bible fiasco too.
Right. So, that would make sense.
Yeah.
Let's see. Eternalism.
Just for people, if there's any Orthodox here, I was in contact with Mount Athos, and they delayed sending my book for almost a year. So they sent me a prayer rope, and this as an apology. So.
Well, I've been to the gate of Mount Athos, but you're not allowed in without special permission, and no women are allowed at all. Yeah. It's a very ancient place. Let's see. Eternalism says Revelation 22, the last page of the Bible, is titled by the NIV, Eden Restored, reverses the curse of Genesis 2 and 3. Not sure what he means there. Do you?
I have to look at Genesis. I don't remember verses the way a lot of people do. I'd have to look at the verses.
Let's see.
I'm sure it has something to do with Adam being tossed out of paradise.
Let's see. And then Daniel is talking about in the book of Revelation, it's called the doctrine of Nicolaitans.
One of the interesting things that just came to my mind, though, is Joseph Priestley, who's supposedly the guy who discovered oxygen, was actually sort of coming from Newton and stuff, was actually the founder of the Unitarians. And originally, I believe this is right. If it's not right, it's close to right. He didn't call it oxygen, he called it phlogiston. And the reason he called it that is because the early term for logos was flogos with a PH or F, if you want to call it that. And so he figured, they had all these bizarre formulas as to why flames consumed things and things. He founded the basis of oxygen as being the why things burned, but he misinterpreted from his point of view as he thought it had something to do with flogos, going all the way back to Genesis. So
let's see. Happy to see another episode. You two are an inspiration. I pray for your peace in these trying times. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's see. And then Eternalism says, and that was from Ark for the Floods. Eternalism says you might like Spencer Smith, YouTuber's forthcoming New Age expose 1, Adam 4, Christian conservative.
The thing is, one of the things that got me is taking a lot of courses in scholasticism. I know that's kind of controversial for some, but it exposed me to what was really going on. And it's probably too abstract and complicated, but I think just taking episodes like this and just telling the real story behind them, it kind of breaks the spell. It does,
Right. Well, it's like, exposing that Harvard's inoculation experiments were spun into, stupid, naive Christians in 1693 that resulted in the massacre of so-called witches when Harvard was doing these inoculation experiments, and Cotton Mather, whose own grandfather founded Harvard, was in control of the Salem witch trials, and they're intentionally spinning it all and creating a spell against Christianity that lasted for 330 years.
But what surprises me is I forgot where I just saw it in the last couple of days, is Harvard was a very Christian school at one time, but they embraced Arianism. And I still think that more so than Vatican II, more so than all this other stuff, it's the reemergence of Arianism.
So let's see. Going back from what I saw from Harvard and John Mather and Cotton Mather and these guys, the original founders of Harvard, was that they were involved in these Royal Society attacks on Christianity from the get-go.
And that makes sense if you understand people, I think, have searched for a long time as what really is the occult. and I think they've purposely disguised their fundamental doctrines. Why is science based in the occult? What's the connection? And why did, when science got pushed, what's its true connection to alchemists? You can look up Isaac Newton. He's well into Hermeticism.
Yeah, sure.
I still think it's this very simple but abstract principle that everything resolves into the one. And once you buy into that, you're willing to sacrifice every contradiction in the world, because that's your supreme point of view. And the way you get there is by you quit making distinctions, you quit using reason, and everything, you deceive yourself into believing that if I can just ignore things like gender and stuff like that, I can perceive the world as one entity.
Well, that brings up something that I wanted to bring up earlier. Let's see. What's the one gender entity called again?
Oh,
here, I'm gonna bring him up on.
no, there's several words, I think.
I had him up earlier. Oh, here it is. Yeah, it'd be nice if we were able to make a direct connection here. But here, let me, oh boy. I'm just gonna share screen real quick. We've got this little guy right here. Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. You are warned I'm just flashing this for a second. Here we go. So this guy is the original unisex, androgynous, probably hermetic deity. You can see he's got the boobs, and he looks like a tranny.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
It could be a real picture of a real guy for all you know.
Right. Yeah. Well, and if you get into the hammer of the heretics and stuff, it's all about, it argues.
I'm surprised though, how many, once you get these episodes going on after Egypt and Champollion stuff, it took me a long time, but I did find a book that was supposedly the counter to what Champollion was doing. And it was a Catholic book explaining the heavens. I've got it here someplace.
So we have a bunch of questions to catch up with.
But the thing was, what I was amazed at is a lot of the book was dedicated to Hermeticism too. So they had bamboozled everybody.
So Daniel Ritter wants to know, will Mark Passio ever admit how wrong he has been about his biblical interpretations? No, and he'll never admit that he was helping to run teams of trolls against me, especially the vegan ones. Boru, why is science in the occult? That's a show I want to hear. And then Chris,
let me answer that real quickly, because I've sort of answered it already. Is they installed, I believe, in the places like the Royal Academy, this principle that you didn't know was an occult principle. Is that one of the things I think you got to do is you got to separate science from technology. We've seen a lot of technological innovations, but there has not been much scientific innovations for 50, 60 years.
Yeah.
The thing is the idea that you see it in quantum mechanics, you see it in, if you want proof of this, go to YouTube and just type in Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And you'll see priests, you'll see mathematicians, you'll see physicists all in dismay that Gödel disproved their fundamental theory. Well, their fundamental theory is that that everything aspires to this oneness and just melds into this kind of abstract unity. And that's not just matter, it's thought, it's everything. That the idea that you have a distinction at all, even in your thought, is an illusion. And so what happened is, I think, even though that was the highest of occult principles, that they've seldom even write it anywhere, it was an easy sell to the scientific community. It allowed science to discover certain things and deceive us on certain things. People like Einstein, for decades were aspiring to try to figure out the universal field, equation. You look at the Big Bang. It started off with this idea of this almost, nobody asked, well, what was before the Big Bang? But they'll ask, well, what was before God? And so what happens is you end up with the idea, and I was taking astronomy courses at the time where they were convinced that the universe would expand to a point and that it would eventually not be able to withhold it, and it would collapse upon itself and you'd get the rebirth. Well, that's basic Buddhism. And they were all dismayed when they found out that the universe will never collapse, that the formulas don't work. So what you get is this idea of simple occult principles, I believe, that people never connected to being in the occult, but were an easy sell to science.
Yep. And I think the Royal Society, et cetera, was behind stuff like that. Chris Trenholm says, great stuff, guys. Was Kircher a Rosicrucian or Mason?
He wasn't either. Number one, he would have been before the Freemasons. He could have been a Rosicrucian, but I think just putting it at that is probably too simple. I think you said it last time the best. He was kind of a chameleon, really. He probably was, in my estimation, a good Jesuit, a good Hermeticist. You just name it, because he was collecting data from all the world. I think he understood all the data. He just didn't worry about whether it contradicted each other. Descartes called him a fool, but still followed some of his,
So somebody wrote, the Mornon wrote Trainus Tranfomet.
Okay.
For Baphomet. Tranfomet. So the worshippers of Baphomet are
Tranfomet. I could get on board with that.
Yeah, I'm on board. That makes more to laugh at. Let's see. This is Derek. Does Steve have an idea of how the author John went from writing Revelation with more Hebraic images versus John having Greek philosophical images?
There's always an argument as to what the Bible was written in. The biggest argument is probably Matthew, in that there does exist Hebrew Matthews out there. I've got one. But if you take a course from a seminary, they pretty much deny that it exists. My personal feeling is that I think Jerusalem, Israel at that time was kind of the centerpiece where all these different things mixed. But I don't buy into the idea that Greek philosophy can be simplified to an ancient mythology. There was just too much learning there. But I do think they were Jews. They saw things in terms of their own imagery.
Perennial philosophy, yes, indeed. And there's
two versions of perennial philosophy too. There's the Jesuit version and there's the Neo-Platonist version. Sometimes they
and who is one of the biggest writers of perennial philosophy?
Well, again, there's two different branches. Which one are you thinking of?
Well, hold on a second.
That Madame Blavatsky got on board with that, and
Yeah, well, but hold on. So you have Hermes Trismegistus and the Hermetic tradition, and Sufism, which of course is the fountainhead of Islam, and that flows into perennial tradition. And who comes out of perennial tradition? Oh, we haven't mentioned them in this show, ladies and gentlemen. Here you go. Aldous Huxley. Yay, we got him in there. And then, of course, Jiddu Krishnamurti, one of the biggest frauds of all. Well, no, he's
my only argument is that I do have Catholic books signed off by the papacy, signed off by to publish a Catholic book up until recently, you had to have an imprimatur to sign off on it. And some of these books they're very good books, but they call themselves perennial philosophy also. So you don't need it. The term really exists in both camps.
Daniel made it funny.
Okay.
That was good,
Yeah.
Daniel. Oh, well, he's making fun of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. He said,
there's a story too.
Yeah, he said Pierre de la Fart du Chardin.
I've got a book where he admits he was part of the hoax.
Oh, yeah. Oh, do you?
Yeah.
Of the Piltdown or which hoax?
Piltdown. And you know who the only other...
who helped Pierre de Chardin with the Piltdown hoax? Do you remember?
Oh, yeah. That's what I was going to say.
Who?
The guy who wrote Sherlock Holmes.
Well, okay. There is another one. Who else?
I forget. I haven't read it in a while.
Julian
Huxley. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle is the only one that they could pin it on. And so the argument is which one of them did it.
Arthur Conan Doyle.
So is that they probably both did it then.
Well, Arthur Conan Doyle was influenced by, and I'm looking in the shit. Wait, sorry folks for the language there. I gotta share screen here. Oh, this stuff is always funny. All right, so here's Emanuel Swedenborg. And somebody brought up Dr. John D in the chat. I meant to get to that. We never did. Yeah. Here's Arthur Conan Doyle and the Piltdown hoax.
There you go.
There you go. Right there.
Sherlock Holmes right there.
Yeah. So, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, yeah, I probably put that in the database like 8 or 10 years ago and forgot about it. And then Piltdown hoax. Here's Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And then here's his
Neo-Platonism.
Yeah. But who's right here?
Yeah.
So when
they all know each other.
Oh, yeah, they're all friends. And then who influenced this clown fraud right here? Terence McKenna. And so, so Terence McKenna got a whole lot of his stuff from Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And then, so Terence McKenna got his, what was that? Now I forget what it was, but, the omega point theory and all of that. He got it directly from.
That's to return everything to the one.
Right. Well, yeah, right. And so Terence McKenna took the one theory, the omega point, the Neoplatonist singularity point, blah, 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 and he turned it into time wave zero.
Yeah.
Habit and novelty theory. So that's where Terence McKenna got that from. So we can see they're all involved in this same thread. And then Pierre de Chardin, he influences Theodosius Dobzhansky, the big eugenicist that signed on to the Eugenicist Manifesto. And so Dobzhansky is in-laws with Professor Michael Coe, who wrote the 2012 or 2011 end of the world, Aztec Maya calendar nonsense. So all of these guys are right in here. So it's actually pretty funny because what you're discovering right now is what I had been discovering on the other side for years, but now you've taken it all the way back through Neoplatonism, et cetera, to expose this whole fraud. If we go up here to Emanuel Swedenborg, so he influences
all third-rate academics that are just all happen to be related, and they got power.
Yeah, and wait, and they're all tied to the Royal Society too. So Emanuel Swedenborg influences Aldous Huxley, Arthur Conan Doyle, Carl Gustav Jung, right? Helena Blavatsky.
Carl Jung is actually has some of the most important archaeological stuff. Even I think he's even owned some of the quintessential Gnostic texts.
So I have synchronicity underneath Emanuel Swedenborg here, and here's William James and William Blake, and we've got all of the. And we go over here. Here's Dr. John D. And who else do we see here? But Hassani Sabah, the Muslim who created the, the whole 70 virgins and the Hashishans or the assassins,
Well,
etc.
that also goes back to Judas Iscariot.
Yeah.
Because
And
Iscariot.
so,
So
but wait. So where did Timothy Leary take his pilgrimage at? He followed the path of Hassani Sabah. And then from that, you have Sabbatai Zevi
But I think that actually goes back to the beginning too, because Judas Iscariot, it's fairly well known that Iscariot is a misspelling of the word Sicariot, which means knife. And then on Masada, you actually have a false prophet up there that's claiming to be Messiah and all that kind of stuff. And,
so now it's all coming together, but it's funny that all of this stuff has been mapped in the database for a decade.
What's funny to me, it's not just that, is what I'd like to write a book on this. It'd be 3,000 pages. I mean, it's all reputable stuff that they're just hiding.
We're going to have to get the Phillips brothers on here.
Yeah. they could do it.
Or no, the Collins brothers. Sorry.
Oh, right. I knew what you were talking about.
Yeah. Sorry, Collins brothers, Philip and what's the other one's name? Sorry. I need to follow up with them. They wrote me a while ago. And
what always strikes me is Carol Quigley's comment that all these major universities like Harvard and Yale and Cambridge are really just finishing schools for third-rate academics. And
Paul and Philip. Third rate, yeah, for third-rate academics. That's funny. So looks like, we've done some good exposing in here today, and maybe people who are paying attention will be able to start connecting all the dots. We are negligent to mention the role of the artist in the perpetuation and influence upon all Christianity. Okay, not sure where they're going with that. H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells was Aldous Huxley's mentor.
You look at Renaissance art and stuff, if you know how to see it, even in Christian art, you can see the Hermetic influence on certain cases where they're,
Bosch invented the new hell, Dura, a new God unto himself, etc. Well, yeah, that goes into Professor Carl Ruck's garbage, the whole neurotic world.
But the big problem is that, when we've had this discussion is what you could legitimately claim that Christianity has a basis in Hermeticism until you realize that this is an internal war within Christianity itself, that the ape of Christ literally has been existing at the highest levels. That doesn't mean that I'm not blaming the Catholic Church for that. It's just a fact that probably you pick a church, you're going to find the ape of that church well within inside that hierarchy somewhere.
And they've made sure to infiltrate everybody with their garbage.
And that's why I've been trying to fish for what's a simple point that you can understand this by without knowing all these perennial philosophies and taking 20 years to figure it out. And I think the simple point is this reducing things to this one, that if you understand the one is the goal of science, is modern religion and all this stuff, and that one is an impossibility. And
it's historically the greatest heresy that the church fought against for 2,000 years.
Yes.
So so what they had to do is infiltrate the church, and we showed the document last week of them taking over for the position of the Pope. Then we have Vatican II. Then we have all of this garbage being promoted since, and now they promote the church, and they brought out the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is a Gnostic.
I think that's still the pivotal one, and most people haven't quite. You needed a modern evidence that the average academic couldn't refute.
Well, people need to either go back and watch our shows from a couple years ago on the Dead Sea Scrolls, or we need to revisit it and do
we could revisit it, because I've got more stuff now than what I had. I have the FOIA documents connecting it to the CIA, which I didn't have before.
Right.
Maybe
Are
I hate
you
to say-
saying, Steve, that the CIA invented mushrooms, man?
I'm saying I think maybe people are finally ready to hear what they wouldn't hear 3-4 years ago.
Yeah.
Now you're starting to see the plot unfold in a grander scale. Maybe now people will believe, what we're saying.
Well, of course they shadow ban the show everywhere, and they have since around 2015 because all of this stuff started getting out and
All right.
going big time, so all right. Well, anything else to add before we wrap it up?
I'm good. It's my wife's birthday. I said I'd eat with her, and we'll see if she's ready yet. Maybe it's too late now. I don't know.
All right. Well, say hi to your wife and happy birthday to her. And Boru says, please revisit the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Oh, I had fun doing it. We could do that next week if you want.
And then Smokey says, I always take this show with a grain of salt. Well, we'll provide you more facts in this show than anyone else, anywhere else, I would bet you. So feel free to fact check us, Smokey. Very worth the look into Alexander Wow here on YouTube, and John Anthony ties to hidden codes in the KJV. I'm not sure about that, but I haven't looked into it. All right. Well, I think that's a wrap. And until next time, everybody, thanks for this support. LogosMedia.com. Please support and donate to the show. Pick up Steve's books are all linked in the show notes below for you to pick up. Yeah, somebody mentioned we need to get Hans on. Definitely want to do that as well. But we should get Hans up to speed on all of this. What I was thinking the other day, Steve, was we should have Hans on together and cover all of this. And he could just pile on a whole lot of data, I bet.
I'm sure he could.
So
nobody's making anything up here. I mean, it's that's the hard part for me, is what sounds reasonable, totally reasonable, sounds probably outrageous to a lot of people, but you can look it up.
Yeah. Well, Smokey probably hasn't spent the last 15 years fact checking the work that has been put out on this show like many people have. So he has to take it with a grain of salt. So anyway, as long as he's fact checking, that's all that matters, right? And that's why we put out the Trivium, to fact check what we're doing here. Anyway, Steve, take care.
Okay. Next time.
Yep. Next time, everybody, have a great night. Bye-bye.
Every book